My neighbor's son needed a ride. You won't believe what unfolded next. Remember to give the video a thumbs up, share your insights in the comments, and subscribe to keep up with our newest narratives. A simple favor from my neighbor transformed into an unforgettable night, something I never anticipated, yet life often surprises us when we least anticipate it. It was a warm, humid evening in mid-July when I heard the knock at my front door, having just wrapped up the post-dinner cleanup. For a brief moment, I found myself hesitating. It was late, and I found myself in my cozy nightwear, just an old t-shirt and some loose pajama pants. However, I had always held a fondness for Tyler. He was a decent young man, dependable and compassionate. I let out a soft sigh, shaking my head slightly, a faint smile playing on my lips. Allow me 5 minutes to make a change. He smiled broadly, his voice heavy with fatigue. The radio emitted a gentle hum, a languid bluesy melody that perfectly complemented the serene closeness of the scene. For a moment, silence enveloped us both. It felt unusual. A heaviness lingered in the atmosphere, an unvoiced tension suspended between us. I couldn't quite pinpoint it, yet I sensed it deeply. At last, Tyler shattered the stillness. Have you ever pondered how swiftly time passes by? I cast a fleeting look in his direction. Constantly. I swear I was just in high school last year, he said, gazing out the window. At this moment, I find myself navigating through the complexities of my existence, and it seems as though I'm already lagging behind. I nodded, fully grasping the sentiment. Life has a peculiar knack for making us feel as though time is slipping away, regardless of our age. He turned his head toward me then, his gaze lingering just a moment too long. Have you ever experienced that feeling? I gulped. His voice carried a certain earnestness, a subtle yearning, that quickened my heartbeat. Constantly, I confessed. I shared with him the stories of my youth, the opportunities one had shied away from, the love that had slipped away, and the moments I had allowed to pass me by. At some point, it dawned on me that Tyler was not merely discussing his own experiences. He was speaking of me, of us, of a connection that had been subtly blossoming in the silence of the night. As we arrived at his destination, a poorly illuminated apartment complex on the fringes of town, the atmosphere surrounding us was heavy, with an unspoken tension that neither of us dared to acknowledge. He paused before pushing the door open. Mrs. Tyler. My voice carried a gentle strength. He let out a breath, shaking his head. Forget it. As he emerged from the car, a moment of hesitation gripped him. He turned back, his gaze locking onto mine, and for a fleeting moment, everything else around us disappeared. And then, in an instant, he vanished, slipping away into the darkness. I hardly found any rest that night. My thoughts circled back to the drive. The conversation, the way Tyler had gazed at me, as if he perceived something deeper within me than merely being his neighbor. I convinced myself that it was all in my head, that I was overanalyzing a mere instance, yet, beneath the surface, I was aware of the truth. Morning arrived, bringing with it a sense of restless unease. I navigated my daily tasks on automatic. A cup of coffee, a stroll in the morning, tending to my plants. Yet, I couldn't dispel the sense that something had changed. I didn't anticipate running into Tyler again so quickly, just after noon. Another knock echoed at my door. My breath hitched in my throat. I paused before turning the knob, my hand lingering just above it for a moment that stretched into eternity, and there he stood. He appeared transformed in the daylight. The gentle afternoon sun enveloped him in a warm embrace, highlighting the defined contours of his jawline with a soft radiance. His dark hair remained slightly tousled, and his gray t-shirt hugged his broad frame in a manner I hadn't truly observed before. "Hey," he said, his voice slightly gravelly, as if he'd been mulling over this visit just as much as I had. "Hey," I responded, maintaining a steady tone. There was a pause, heavy and prolonged. I finally shattered "Is everything all right?" He exhaled softly, adjusting his stance. "Absolutely. I just wanted to express my gratitude for yesterday evening." I crossed my arms, resting against the doorframe. "You have already expressed your gratitude to me. I understand, but I aim to approach it correctly." He raised a small brown paper bag and extended it toward me. "It's from that quaint little cafe on Main. I recalled that you enjoyed their pastries." That took me by surprise. I took the bag, my fingers grazing his, and for a fleeting moment, that same tension from the previous night ignited once more. "You didn't have to do that," I said, with a gentler tone this time. I had the desire to. I moved to the side. "May I come in?" He paused for just a moment before giving a nod. In my kitchen, we lingered, enveloped by the rich aroma of fresh coffee and warm, buttery pastries that danced in the air. He took a sip of his drink, his fingers absent-mindedly tracing the rim of the cup. "Last night, you appeared to be quite different," I finally remarked. Tyler looked up at me, his expression a mystery. "What do you mean?" I exhaled deeply, looking for the perfect words. "I'm not sure, just a bit more subdued, more earnest than normal." He swept a hand through his hair. "I suppose I was simply lost in thought." "Concerning what?" He paused, uncertainty flickering in his mind. At last, he met my gaze. "What can you tell me about yourself?" My stomach dropped. "Tyler." I realized this might sound a bit out there, he said hastily, leaning in a bit, his hands intertwined. "I want to ensure you feel at ease. Yet, last night, there was an unmistakable shift, wasn't there?" I swallowed, clutching my coffee cup a bit more firmly. I might pretend, I might dismiss it, yet, we were both aware of the reality. "Yes," I confessed, my voice barely rising above a whisper. A gradual release of air escaped his lips, as if he had been waiting to breathe for far too long. "I can't recall when it began," he whispered. "Perhaps it has existed all along, and I simply failed to recognize it until this moment." My heart raced within my chest. This was not meant to occur. I was 28 years his senior. I had known him since his teenage years. Yet, last night, and even now, it wasn't a child sitting before me. A man stood there. A man gazed at me as if I were something he had desired for ages. I ought to have put an end to it. One ought to have concluded this situation before it escalated any further. But then he extended his hand across the table, his fingers grazing mine, lingering in that moment, anticipating. For the first time in ages, I allowed myself to ponder. What if I chose to stay? I ought to have withdrawn my hand. I ought to have brushed it aside, transformed the situation into something humorous. Or softly pointed out to Tyler that I was his neighbor, and that this was utterly absurd. However, I did not. Instead, I allowed the silence to linger between us, my fingers resting beneath his. The warmth of his touch permeating my skin. My heart raced, the atmosphere in my kitchen abruptly feeling dense, almost electric. Tyler remained still, offering no resistance. He simply observed me, poised in anticipation, his eyes, deep brown, filled with an indescribable emotion, locked onto mine, unwavering. At last, I breathed out, withdrawing my hand, severing whatever connection had just formed between us. Tyler, I said, my voice gentler than I meant. I fumbled to articulate the right words. Surprisingly, he completed it on my behalf. I released a breathless laugh. That's certainly a perspective. He reclined, massaging the nape of his neck, a subtle, nearly anxious smile flickering at the edges of his mouth. I truly didn't intend for this to happen, I promise. Last night, in your presence and during our conversation, I came to a realization. I lingered. He paused, then began, his voice soft and deliberate. I've never encountered anyone quite like you. A tiny, piercing ache shot through me. Tyler, I am 52. He tilted his head, a smile playing at the corners of his lips. And you're a mature individual, he interjected, maintaining eye contact with me. I understand my emotions. I'm not bewildered. I placed my hands firmly on the table, attempting to find my balance. This is not a matter of confusion. It concerns the essence of existence. What are you? He inquired softly. Too youthful. Is it truly significant? I gulped nervously. Perhaps it ought to. He observed me intently for a considerable time. Is that truly your perspective, or is that merely what you believe you ought to express? That struck a profound chord. I parted my lips, only to seal them once more. I had devoted years to convincing myself of what was suitable, what was correct. I had exercised great care and caution. Yet the way Tyler gazed at me, the way he made me feel acknowledged, truly seen, was an experience I hadn't felt in ages. Tyler. I let out a sigh, shaking my head in disbelief. This is not straightforward. He smiled, and there was an air of youthful charm mixed with an unmistakable self-assurance in it. I have no issue with complexity. A laugh slipped from my lips, surprising and airy. Naturally, you don't. There was nothing but quiet, then, his voice, tranquil, unwavering. I understand. I turned around slowly, facing him, allowing the truth to linger in the space between us. This was not a decision I could take lightly. But for the first time in a long while, I found myself not wanting to decline. I ought to have declined. I ought to have accompanied Tyler to the door, expressed my gratitude for the pastries, and bid him farewell as he departed. I ought to have brushed aside the flutter in my chest when he gazed at me as if I were more than merely his neighbor. Consistent, unwavering. He was not a boy. He was certain. He was fully aware of his emotions. The question lingered, could I permit myself to experience the same emotions? Morning arrived, ushering in a fresh sense of clarity. I refused to be shackled by the weight of others' expectations. I had devoted a significant portion of my life to making the right decisions, adhering to the expected course, and where had it taken me? To tranquil evenings in solitude, to instances when I scarcely acknowledged the reflection staring back at me. I yearned to experience the thrill of life once more. A handful of days went by before I encountered him once more. As I tended to my garden, the sound of his voice reached my ears. Greetings. Unfamiliar one. I turned, shielding my eyes from the sun, and there he was, leaning against his car, observing me with that same inscrutable expression. You've been avoiding me, he said. Though his tone held no accusation. I had to reflect. I conceded. He nodded, conveying an air of comprehension, and I exhaled gently, and I feel a sense of fear. He moved nearer, his presence anchoring the moment. Consistent. What do you mean? What this signifies? Of what others will perceive. Of experiencing pain. His expression became gentler.